Professor at the Institute for European Studies, Free University in Brussels. And my name is Christopher Coker, and I am the author of a book called The Rise of the Civilization State and the Unmaking of World Order. I also had the privilege of being co-director of LSE Ideas, which is also a partner, as you'll see, of the conference. We're going to have a 15-minute session in which I will ask Richard some questions about the report, and then we're going to go after that into a larger panel discussion. I will invite the panelists at that point to come up and join me on the stage. So, without further ado, I shall sit down in the most informal way. Let me just make a few opening remarks. Civilization state, when did it actually start? Well, it entered public currency. In other words, it entered the political domain as recently as 2013 at the Valdai Conference, when Vladimir Putin described Russia for the first time, I think, I beg to be corrected, as a civilization state. And at the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping, some years ago, also referred to China as a civilization state. There are a number of points that one could make, which are both positive and negative about the concept. The positive is that civilization has become the currency of international politics, I think for good in some respects, because we're moving away from what Martin Jakes once described as Euro-provincialism, which is, in a sense, privileging the European Enlightenment as being the be-all and end-all of the debate about values. There are other civilizations and other values that have been airbrushed out of history for the last 250 years, and they're coming back, and they're represented by many of the speakers at this conference. The negative elements, and there are negative elements, is that it is a highly elitist idea. I don't know to what extent it has much popular purchase in countries like China and Russia, or whether it's just an intellectual discourse. We must always be careful in an age of populism that we don't engage in intellectual discourses. Another criticism in my own civilization, the West, is that it seems to be an authoritarian discourse. I think the interesting case is India, where Modi has made no attempt to disguise his wish to make India into a civilizational state, but that has, of course, produced an enormous amount of criticism from people who think that it will be shanghaied by ethno-nationalists who really don't think that the Muslim presence in India, or indeed the Muslim era of Indian history, which has been a very extensive one, is actually part of Indian civilization. But here I am discussing, Richard, some other points which bear on economics and the economics agenda. Because when we're talking about the civilizational state, I think two responses will be. One, well, it's all really about the economy, isn't it? And the second is that the civilizational state, we mentioned the environment today, privileges the human all the time and culture, perhaps over the planet and the environment and the global. So, Richard, if I could ask you, first of all, when this debate begins, I think, in Asia, is over the Asian values debate in the 1980s, where we were told that Asians invested more in their children's future, that they were more productive, and that this was the beginning of the end of the Western moment in history. Value in economics has been there since Max Weber's essay on the Protestant ethic. He was very interested in Confucianism and China. Could you just say something about economics and values?
Happy to, and thank you for the plug for the report, Chris. I love the idea of the use of the word Shanghai, by the way, in this context.
Very unfortunate.
Yeah. Let me say two things by way of starter, and then specifically to Chris's comment. When I started writing this report, the tools that we usually work with in international relations are geostrategic ones and geoeconomic ones. And it was quite clear that, and they usually operate individually, it was quite clear that there was a missing dimension, the dimension that Chris has referred to with the rise of the idea of civilization and culture and geoculture. And of course, the dominant tradition, particularly since the end of the Cold War period, the rise of globalization, was the absolute ascendancy of economic science, and it thought of itself as a science, as the dominant ordering principle of the world, particularly Hayekian understandings. And there was no role in this scientific approach towards understanding world order for what we might call the cultural dynamics of international relations. This, of course, all changed. The backlash against globalization, which didn't happen overnight, but if you wanted to put a date on it, it's 2008. Or if you're Asian, you would put the first Asian financial crisis of 1997 on it. But it became clear that economic science didn't actually do everything and tell everything for us in the way the world worked. And what scholars in various parts of the world were trying to do was bring in what we might call, for want of a better expression, the non-scientific elements of the economy. And that meant culture and civilization. And a couple of reasons for this, and one of them, not the least of which, was the backlash against globalization that took place in a range of different parts of the world. No one doubts the ability of globalization as the world's greatest aggregator of wealth over time. But of course, its distributional consequences were massively uneven. And the major beneficiaries of it, ironically, were the 500 million people in China and the 500 million people in India who saw themselves progressively lifted in this process. And the major victims of it were the traditionally well-heeled middle classes, manufacturing sectors of the developed world. So this gave rise to this idea of populism as a political force in some ways. And that could only be explained in a range of different ways. And one of them was the rise of identity politics. And it's identity politics that sheets home the relationship specifically between culture and the civilization argument in international relations and the traditional political economy arguments in international relations. So that's the link, in short, answer to your first question.
Now, is there a distinction to be drawn between globalization and globalism, the ideology?
Absolutely. Globalization is, if we think about it, a practical economic activity. What were its characteristics? Its characteristics were open liberalization of trade, financial deregulation, asset privatization, these kinds of things. Globalism was much more political and ideological. Globalization, economic globalization, was in large part underwritten by a theory that we know as economists as comparative advantage. And that, ironically, has begun to become unpicked in the 21st century for a range of reasons to do with the changing nature of trade, digitalization, communication, those kinds of things. What happened, though, was that in the hands of populist politicians, or not even populist politicians, globalization became to be called globalism, and the target of globalism were what was seen as the corporate cosmopolitan elites that were the major beneficiaries of globalization at the expense of those who suffered the distributional consequences. So to be anti-globalism is very strongly ideological. To be anti-globalization is usually a technical debate over the nature of the deregulation of finance and the nature of trade liberalization.
So are we moving into a world where you're going to have two parallel systems, a US-centric system and a Sino-centric system, or are we moving into a world of regionalisms? Because all the time we hear concepts such as, obviously, the Great Belt and Road, the American alternative to the Great Belt and Road, which is the Indo-Pacific community, some Indians talking about an Afro-Asian century, the growth of regional organizations like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is driven by neo-mercantilism to some extent. Where are we actually heading?
Well, if we knew that question, the answer to that question, we would be in a much more comfortable position than we are. At the moment, the big agenda for the US, for example, is, and they use the word increasingly nowadays, is to decouple from China. What started out as a Trumpian argument about the gross inequality in the balance of trade between the US and China has moved on considerably. The trade imbalance is a second-order question. The bigger questions are about the competition between the US and China for control of the new technologies, artificial intelligence, cyberspace, those kinds of things. And the American strategy at the moment is what it likes to call decoupling. It effectively wants to see the Chinese economy decoupled from the American. That's not going to happen. The nature of the global supply chains are so integrated, and so dominated by China that it's not going to take place. And to the extent that it does take place, the US would be as big a victim of it as the Chinese, who are the targets of it. So I don't think in what we might call real economic terms, we're going to see two systems. The systems are totally integrated. I think in ideological terms, there is the danger of seeing the development of the civilizational state on the... And of course, bear in mind that Trump and some of his people now make civilizational arguments. There's a quote in the report from Trump that says our civilization will stand, will not be tested. There's the quote in the report from the Assistant Secretary from the American State Department who said that the fight with Russia, with the Soviet Union, the first Cold War, was fine because it was a fight within the family. But the ensuing Cold War, the potential Cold War with China, was the first time that America would be fighting against a non-Caucasian state. So there are attempts in some areas. For example, there is now in the US the reintroduction of the Committee for the Present Danger, which had been very strong in the first Cold War and is now geared towards China. So I don't think economically you're going to see the disintegration, but politically you can. The idea that there might be regional worlds, we've got in the audience Amitav Acharya. He's much better, I think he's on your panel.
He is indeed.
He will talk to you about his multiplex world, which answers that question much better than I could.
Okay. Well, time is unfortunately coming along. I have only time to ask you one long question. A very important element in the whole civilization state debate is the end of the American hegemony. So what is the end of American hegemony? We hear this term. Is it the fact that American unilateralism, which encourages unilateralism by other countries? Is it the use of supply chains to coerce countries, which is against the whole free trade idea? Is it the weaponization of the dollar, which may reduce interest in the dollar as an international currency? What actually is the end of American hegemony?
Well, the 4 points that you've identified are, if you like, some of the empirical things. That, I mean, just to go in reverse order, Russia and China now, for example, are beginning to move towards doing exchanges in the renminbi. Ironically, and this will come as a surprise to some people in this room, the euro has been a lot stronger than everyone expected it to be given the crisis of the last few years. So, but the dollar is still the strongest currency in the world. It still gives America what was called that exorbitant privilege. The United States is still the most powerful state in the world. The idea of American liberal hegemony was always in some ways overstated. It was never as liberal as it was meant to be, and it was never as hegemonic as it meant to be. But for much of the American leadership of the kind that we've got at the moment, with this idea of making America great again, it's the rhetorical element of it as much as the practical element of it that is the major problem. To the extent that we can reform world order, clearly many elements of what were the liberal order are going to remain. And they're going to remain because they're useful. It doesn't matter that they were American in origin. The Chinese want to reform this order. They do not want to undermine this order. They benefit from it. They just want a bigger share of it. They want the rules to benefit them. They're not in the business of turning it upside down. The question is the degree to which the US, not under this current administration, I grant you, but in the future, may well be able to re-engage in some kind of accommodation discussion with China in that sense. So the prospects of, you could say that we've got a bipolar world re-emerging again already, but it's much more complex than that.
Well, thank you very much.
And we address it in the report.
Well.
Please read the report, and if you don't like it, stop me in the corridor and tell me, okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, regrettably, we only had 15 minutes for that session. You will understand we are seriously over time. We are planning to end this session at 4 o'clock, which will give you a truncated coffee break, but at least it will give you the opportunity to be revivified with coffee. Can I invite my fellow... And your names are around the table. Very good to meet you. You're here. Yeah. Hello.
Yeah.
Indeed. Nice to meet you. Hello. Sorry. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to introduce my fellow panelists for the simple reason that we have time constraints. You will read who they are in the program. Some of them, like Dr. Yukunin, of course, you've met already. Let me go around the table, inviting each person, starting on my far right here, to state in 5 minutes what they would like to say. I will respond with a question, and then we go on to the next panelist. And after we've done that, I will encourage a panel discussion between all of you before perhaps having a question and answer session, if we have the time to do that. So, if I may start with you.
First of all,
you need the
yes.
microphone.
I have my microphone. Yes, I have.
Oh, you have been wired up.
Yes.
Okay.
First of all, I'm very glad to be here. It's a very meaningful forum, the Dialogue of Civilization, which this morning we had very interesting debate. And I think that the second session that we will handle now will be in the continuation of the session of this morning. I'm representing now here the Turkey, the point of view of Turkey, how Turkey is perceived the value system, how Turkey is perceived the civilization and the dialogue of civilization. First of all, the question is always people asking if Turkey is a part of Europe or is a part of Asia. The answer is Turkey is a part of Eurasia. And I would like to just remember to the public here that Turkey is coming from the Central Asia, from the Ural-Altaic region. This is why we have more in common with countries like Russia, China than Europe. We are a part of European history, but we are not a part of the European culture. And this morning we had a very interesting debate about the meaning of universal value. And as Ms. Islam is talking this morning, it was very interesting that we cannot impose a system of value to a different culture and civilization, which is very important, because this is the mistake of European Union, actually, the Western countries, that they just build up this universal moralism, universal values, but they never took into the consideration that if this value is applicable to the other culture. They never take into the consideration the culture and the value system, the axiology of the other civilization, which is the problem with Turkey, actually. Even with the neighborhood policy, we can just observe that Europe always tried to impose their system of value, saying that this is the best one. How we can judge if the culture of X country is superior or not to other countries? This is the mistake. It's also the, today we are living this actually with the European policies, but in the past it was the cultural imperialism. And unfortunately, Europe is still continue in this way. This is the mistake of European Union, actually. And I would like to express that this morning we are talking about the Turkey Islamist, saying that it's an Islamist country. I would like just to remind that Turkey is a modern, secular and Muslim country. It's not an Islamist country. Maybe the President Erdogan is following a policy where Islam and Muslim countries is important for our foreign policy, because Muslim countries is representing 1.8 billion people around the world. There's 57 countries around the world, and there's no representation of Muslim, and this is why I think that the President Erdogan is trying to play this role of leader, but if it's acceptable or not by other countries is a question mark, of course. But now we are just, with the new foreign policy of Turkey, we are just witnessing the Turkey, observing that Turkey is going through to their origin. Eurasia is becoming more and more important to Turkey. Turkey finally, I say finally, understand that country like Russia, China is very important for us because we have so many things in common. There is more than 300 million Turkic-speaking population around the world, and most of this population is living in the post-Soviet Union. This is why we are more in common altogether. And Eurasia will be most probably the next future for Turkish foreign policy, and we will just observe with the Belt and Road project that Turkey will play a major role in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask you one question for the moment. Is the rise of Turkey as a civilization state partly derived from the fact that there is an internal debate within the European Union about whether the European Union is a Christian or is not a Christian community? We mentioned President Chirac today, who died some weeks ago, who was very keen originally to have in the European Constitution reference to the fact that the European Union was a Christian community. We have a debate between Orban in Hungary and obviously in Poland between what they call a semi-Islamic Europe and a Christian Europe. Has this debate in the last 20 years fueled interest in Turkey?
Yes.
In going in the direction that you've been
Yes,
talking about?
Absolutely, yes. It's more than 56 years that we are waiting at the door of Europe. And the only problem is not only that we didn't respect the Copenhagen criteria. The real problem is that Turkey is a Muslim country. The cultural and religious identity of Turkey is a big problem. We are more than 80 million population, which is also a big country. And there is something which is the European countries is forget. There is more than 6% of the European population is Muslim. And there's 44 million people who are Muslim, who are living actually in Europe as European citizens. So Islam is also in Europe. It's also a part of Europe, a reality of Europe. And Europe should definitely try to integrate the Muslim into their public sphere and system.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Matt.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I am going to make 4 quick points and happy to take questions. First of all, I don't think there are civilizational states or civilization states, but there are civilization regimes or civilization governments. So a lot of the idea of civilization state is actually about domestic politics of regimes, and it is there that the effect of civilizational politics is mostly felt. And unfortunately, it's not good. I agree that civilization states or regimes have gone in the direction of greater intolerance and authoritarianism. But I don't see that as a defining, transforming factor in world politics. Let me tell you why. First of all, huge differences among civilized states. India is not the same as China. China is not the same as Turkey. So creating a homogeneous category of some kind, to me, is very problematic because of the differences among those states. Second, it is not really very new for countries or states to use culture or civilization to define their identity. We have had that, every post-colonial state have done that. Ataturk did that, Nehru did that, Sun Yat-sen did that. And I have, in one of the articles that will be coming out in Ethics and International Affairs, I discuss how they use civilization to legitimize not only their state, but also the country in different ways. So there's a long tradition of it. The United States is a civilized state. A manifest destiny, the Puritan beginning, even what Trump is saying, if class of civilizations of Huntington. So when that thing concept came about, apart from various other consequences, it became kind of a straitjacket for explaining everything that was happening. So if there is a war between, say, US invaded Iraq, clash of civilizations. If Singapore and Malaysia had a conflict, clash of civilizations. It becomes a catch-all, straitjacket explanation. But if you look at world politics today, I don't see the political and strategic alignments in the world falling according to civilizational fault lines. I see a lot of cooperation among US and Saudi Arabia. You can talk about Russia and India, India and Iran. I can go on. I don't see the world is getting organized according to civilizations. So therefore, I have to be careful about the analytical value of this concept. And finally, I would like to point out that we have a normative as well as an explanatory or a descriptive mission here. The idea is to have a dialogue rather than simply explain or describe what is happening. And the dialogue is supposed to lead to something more positive. So I'm taking a normative stance here. What I saw this morning was, to me, too much civilizational nationalism or almost civilizational monologue as opposed to civilizational dialogue. So, and this is not uncommon. I've seen through many international conferences where countries, participants, ex-leaders, current leaders, diplomats, academics, they represent their own country. They say good things about their own country, how good was China, how good is India, how good is Turkey, and they never really indulge in any kind of self-criticism. And to have a proper dialogue of civilizations, we need two things: some modesty and self-criticism. No civilization is perfect. There's no good or bad civilization. Every civilization is good, every civilization is bad. Every civilization imagines itself as a universal civilization. And no civilization is a monolith. There are good and bad elements. As I wrote in one of my articles, there is both darkness and light in every civilization. But we need to have that on the table. And instead of defending our civilizations, I felt really sorry for the European Union this morning, because I thought there were a lot of good things that could be said about the European Union. And not only after 1945, after it was created in the 50s, but the European civilization itself has done a lot of bad things, but also contributed a lot of good things. And that goes for every civilization. That's the first thing, self-criticism, a little bit of introspection. The other one is mutual respect. You cannot really have civilizational dialogue unless you respect each other. Now, this doesn't come out here necessarily, but it comes out in dialogues. I remember Barack Obama, who president I like very much, once said Vladimir Putin reminded him of a bored schoolboy on the back of the classroom. That kind of language is insulting. So I always sat in the back of the class, by the way, just in high school. So this kind of civilization posturing, or kind of, even unintentionally, I think Mr. Obama is a fine, decent man, but that kind of thing has to stop. You have to have mutual respect. And that goes to my very final point, the curriculum. When we teach civilizations, international relations, which is my field, as Stanley Hoffman said, American social science, Western dominated. This is partly because of arrogance, partly because of prejudice, and partly because of ignorance. And partly because we start our IR from the rise of the West. Westphalia, 1648, nation state, coincides nicely with the rise of the West. But if you study international relations IR with civilization as a unit, as opposed to nation state as a unit, you don't have 400 years, you have 4,000 years or 5,000 years. And during that period, a lot of civilizations have come and gone and contributed to world order. So unless you bring that into the curriculum, we will, especially in international relations, we would end up always having this very Western-centric view, Eurocentric view, which many Europeans are beginning to disown these days.
Thank you very much. And I particularly like your point about modesty. I remember a phrase of the British playwright Tom Stoppard: the reason I write dialogue is to contradict myself. And I think you always have to have the willingness to contradict yourself and challenge your own civilizational first principles. Can I just ask you, going back to the debate we had this morning about what the West is, it was very interesting in the week before the Brexit referendum that Donald Tusk said that I fear that if Brexit succeeds, we will see the end of the West as a political civilization. So it's rather different, perhaps, as like America, self-made, not organic, a project, an Enlightenment project, as people once called the United States. Do you see that there is something called the West, which is a political civilization? Do you share that understanding, or would you define it as something else?
Yeah, I mean, I teach a course on civilization, and we discuss this quite a bit. The term West, as all of us know, is a construct. It's a post-Renaissance, post-Enlightenment construct. There was no West, so to speak, in the classical period. I mean, you can say that one of the beginning points of the West is that the division of the Roman Empire. So Western Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. But there was also the concept of Europe is very new. Europe was named after Asia, Princess of Tyre, Europa. Greece was not really a Western civilization. It was appropriated. Greece was a Mediterranean civilization with very strong Asiatic links. And all these things, West, Europe, Asia, by the way, was named by the Romans as a province of the Roman Empire. So it's a very modern construct. And I think it'll be good if we can go beyond that. It's not going to be easy, because it's a simplistic heuristic device that media and everything falls on it. So when Russia takes up, goes into Ukraine, Financial Times, which is a very decent paper, and I really admire, said, Russia has taken Western territory. I always thought Russia as part of the West when I grew up. At least part of Russia. I just came back from St. Petersburg. They see themselves as part of the West. If you go to Moscow, they see themselves as part of Eurasia. So this identity is always political, social construct. It's manipulated, sadly, not only by the leaders, but also by the media, because it's very simplistic. And dialogue and civilizations should transcend the West, non-West divide and have a global civilizational dialogue. I, in my academic hat, promote the idea of global international relations, moving away from non-Western that your colleague Barry Bazan and I started. And I think it's time to move away from that. It's not going to be easy, but certainly the political use of West or non-West, or what is Europe and what is Asia, is definitely part of the problem we're trying to address.
Okay, thank you very much. We move on to, you're living in an area of the world which may be seeing a clash of civilizations, or may not be seeing a clash of civilizations, but it's the area that Huntington was interested in.
Allow me first to say something more general, and then I'll come back to our region. On the one hand, we live in the time of globalization. Perhaps one of the most popular terms that characterize our period is globalization. And what characterizes this is the disappearance of distances from the daily communication between people from different parts of the world. Like when, in the past, when I grew up as a young man, you know, the idea that you can contact someone in Australia from Israel, say, you had to dial, but of course you couldn't dial direct, so you had to call the operator in the, sometimes in the, somewhere in the headquarters of the telecom company in a big city, and you ask to order a telephone call to Australia, and he will say to you, okay, in 48 hours, we will let you know when you can get it. And that's how it worked. Today, you can call Australia instantly, and you can look at the smartphone, and you can see the guy in Australia on a Skype or on the FaceTime in a smartphone and talk to him, and there is no distance, and there are no differences, and you know, communication is instant, in real time. You can do deals that once took a lot of time from one part to the other part. The distinction between territories and countries that characterized life in the past disappeared. There are no distances anymore. So you would expect that that will increase the homogeneity, the cooperation, the closeness between different nations and different countries because of the proximity and the rapidity of communication that is so obvious now. On the other hand, we see the opposite tendency. We see that many important countries in the world return back into its national framework in separation, in distinction from other countries. What characterizes now the rhetoric of the Trump administration, and you know, we can laugh at Trump. It's not difficult. It can be very easy if we want to. But we have to remember that his rhetoric represents a significant part of his country. This is regardless of the manner in which he speaks and the language and the eloquence of his speech and the richness of his English, or the dullness, you still have to remember that it represents a deeper sentiment in the life of America. And what does he say? He says, let's make America great again. America is separate from other countries. He says, why do we have to fight in all these useless wars in different parts of the world? Let's bring back our soldiers to our country. We don't care what happens here and there. The position of America as a global sheriff, for instance, is changing to an isolationism, which is, by the way, it's circular. It was in the past, it perhaps will be different in the future, but it is characteristic of the present mood, not just of America. Go to England, Brexit. What do you want more than Brexit? You don't want to be part of Europe in the way that you were. Okay, you were not as a full member because you had a different currency like most of the other EU's members. But now you want to pull out altogether. You want to establish your national life in complete distinction from other countries in Europe, which is an opposite to what you would expect from the changing of circumstances in the world that we live in. And we can name many other countries, the Chinese with their ambitions, the Iranians that are, are very, very competitive and very distinct from other Muslim countries, and so on and so forth. So I think that this contradiction is something that is of great interest, and we need to think where it will lead to. I just want to say, to repeat one sentence that I said before in the press conference. I said, all this is true. One thing is that there is a globalization, the world is a small village, and we can be in contact with each other, we can be in contact with guys. I am from Israel, can be in contact with guys in Iran to some degree, if I really want to make a special effort to do it, in spite of all the tensions and the differences and the hostilities and whatnot, and so we can be in touch with everyone everywhere. On the other hand, this is the emphasis on the national interest as distinct from interest of other countries. But to a large degree, what characterizes the present circumstances is the use of a rhetoric which may be misleading. You hear some of those speakers, you hear some of those leaders, and you think that tomorrow morning America will wage a war against Iran, America will fight against North Korea, America will destroy the economy of Turkey overnight, and all this nonsense. And just beyond the rhetoric, everyone knows that we live in a world where no one can really afford, seriously, a major military confrontation, a major war. Everyone understands what the prices can be. So the rhetoric, the big words, the bombastic statements make up for the less of action, and thank God that this is so. This is for the world. Now let's go just for a minute to our part of the world.
Very quickly, if I may.
Pardon?
Very quickly, if I may.
Yes. I just want to say that talking about civilizations and dialogue of civilizations, I think the conflict, what characterizes the very special circumstances of the State of Israel, which I was privileged to be the Prime Minister of, is that on the one hand, Israel is what is known, quote unquote, a Western society based on values that are not characteristic of the region that we are part of. And yet, the future of Israel, and we want and we need, and the source of strength of the state of Israel is the fact that it is based on the values of these backgrounds and cultures and societies, and this gives Israel the relative advantage over other countries in the neighborhood because we can be geographically part of our region, but in many other ways we are part of the larger world and we can benefit from it. And yet the destiny and the future of Israel depends entirely on its ability to come to terms with its region. How to reconciliate this conflict between the natural background and values and ethos that characterizes our country on the one hand, with the different values and cultural backgrounds and religious beliefs of the neighborhood that we live in, this is a major challenge for leadership. I only want to say one thing in conclusion to this, is that unfortunately the leaderships of Israel in a large period of time and the leadership of our neighbors both didn't rise to the challenge of how to find a way that can create a common ground in spite of these differences.
Thank you very much. Because of time, I'm going to move on very quickly, but can I just make one response, but not ask you to come back to it. You may wish to come back to it when we open up the general discussion. When you're looking at the Middle East, you are looking at a fascinating area. We had Pan-Arabism in the 50s and early 1960s, an attempt to move beyond the nation state. We have Islamic ISIS, the caliphate, as a rebuke of the existence of the nation state, as blasphemous, in fact. And it is a civilization state, the caliphate, the idea of going back to this original construct. But the biggest issue that really affects the Middle East today is not political or religious, it's environmental. And this is the area that is being hit first by global warming in a very, very serious way. And if you're an Iranian prime minister or you are a Qatari prime minister, you are dealing with the immediacy of global warming in a way that most other countries are not. It's an immediate issue. It seems to me that the civilization state debate does not take enough account of the fact that the environment is the most important thing. Certainly for my students and their future, that is what they care about most. And this is what I was referring to when I mentioned Amitav Ghosh and his book, The Great Derangement, that we are perhaps engaged in the wrong debate. But that's something that I leave open on the table. And I'll go to Dr. Yukin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was closely following your interview with Professor Hugod, and you know, I found myself a little bit at a loss. Why? Because, you know, we very often in expert society, academic society, political societies, we are picking up the term and then we are creating something to explain some elements of international development, relations, through the new wording. Sometimes this is only the frame without the substance. You know, when Professor Hugod was leading this Rhodes report preparation, we started to discuss whether it is correct that term which appeared, I suppose, in one French and one British publication, civilizational state. And we argued, and finally we agree with him, that it is better to use the original meaning, civilization state. Not civilizational, because the flavor of being civic or civilized immediately occurs, surfaces. So in my terminology, and in the terminology of Dialogue of Civilization Research Institute, we are using the term civilization state. This term roots from the work of Russian philosophers Danilevsky and Gumilev. And it is very essential From this point of view, it is not possible to use the term political civilization, which I don't believe, for example, the term economic man. Maybe I'm wrong, but I cannot understand that. From the point of view of those philosophers, civilization that is a historically created cultural type, which sustained. From his point of view, the major players were not the states in the world history, but that cultural types which were communicating, fighting, agreed, or something like that. From this point of view, in the idea of philosophy, of dialogue of civilization, we are opposing the idea that civilization, or as Western experts are sometimes using civilizational, but let it be civilization state, is not contradict the idea of national state. Because, in terms of the development of political system, it were firstly people. And then the people organized themselves into the form of nation. It was Westphalian decision of national state. So the term civilization state and national state, they are just two sides of the same historical coin, if I may say so. It does not contradict each other. The fact that some politicians, like you just mentioned, Trump, is picking up to show it differently, that is just a political trick. It is not academically proven, and so it is not, to my mind, purely correct. So why we started to talk about civilization? It was World Public Forum, Dialogue of Civilizations, 17 years ago, to start to introduce the idea of dialogue of civilizations. At that time, and I suppose you agree with me, even now there are a lot of scientists who would say, what you are talking about? There is only one global civilization of mankind, that's it. But then where the conflicts are coming from, if they are all the same? From this point of view, picking up with the title of our table, even if we are talking about globalization, sometimes we are talking different issues. Globalization as the development of sciences and technologies. Globalization as development of the rules of trade and collaboration. And then, again, globalization as ideology. If you are not following my way, my list of exclusive values, you are not civilized, and you are not, considered to be a partner. Same with the term of civilization state. We should understand that the concept of civilization as historically cultivated group of people, as, our short version is that is, to be absolutely sure, civilization is a community of people with historically developed culture and settled way of life, spiritual values, and law. More broadly, we can add that civilization is a cultural, anthropological community of people that emerges and flourishes in a particular geographical location and in specific ecological and climate conditions. But talking politically wise, I suppose, and this is our insistence, in contemporary politics, we facing the attempt constantly to create dichotomy and some kind of clash, not trying to find what unites the people, but to introduce what is dividing the people. And from this point of view, it is not just academic or theoretical discussion, whether civilization state or civilizational state or political civilization. That is true nature of the difficulties of contemporary period of the development of the people and development of political system. If not accepted that civilizations are different, they can possess very common values. We were thinking this during the first discussion today, but they are different. From this point of view, you know, whether you are African, whether you are European, whether you are Asian, you know, the prospect of the life, the value of the life, it is common. The value of compassion, it is common for many people because it was the way to survive. Then when we're talking today in the morning about, we're discussing about the democracy, we see that it is not the label. This is the process that is a value-based attitude toward the settlement of the most essential conflicts and challenges of common nowadays community.
Thank you. You're a businessman as well, so let me just ask you a question that relates to business. Richard Higgin and I were talking before we began our open session about someone we both know, Susan Strange, who used to teach at my institution, London School of Economics, who said actually there's only one civilization in the world, it's a business civilization. It's the people who go to Davos. It's the people in the airport lounges. It's not about Sumner, it's not about Babylon, it's not about the people of the Indus Valley 5,000 years ago. It's the people who actually make things change. And Robert Cox, not to be mistaken for Michael Cox, of course, who's in the audience, who will be on the panel tomorrow, says that whenever you go to Davos, you're suffering from an existential crisis of dual civilizational ship. Yeah, sure, you may be a Pole, or you may be Japanese, you may be Indian, but you're a businessman at the end of the day, and your first loyalty is to that. What do you have to say about that as a businessman?
I can continue, I can pick up here, and for example, there was a broad introduction some 10 years ago that this is a Coca-Cola civilization. And you know, for those who are employed by this global company, the essence of their life is the prosperity of Coca-Cola company. Can we accept this as civilization? To my mind, no. Same, you know, it is possible to say that business people, business community, this is business civilization. But this is only a label. The substance is different. Business or teacher or driver, they are human beings. They are occupied in a very specific area. If we are talking about Davos, you know, listen, the only thing I can say, people are getting there, and that is platform to communicate. But, you know, they made very serious mistake, after which I'm not that fond of Davos. You remember the crisis of 2008? Several months before, the most valuable experts, the most grand experts, what they predicted? They predicted the flourishing economic development. In several months, we were all in the mess. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, of course, the Chinese call the 2008 crisis a Western financial crisis, not a global financial crisis, but that's another matter. Can I go on to our last panelist?
Thank you, Christopher. So, 4 points. First, I think that for this US administration, the trade war with China and with India to some extent also is about civilizational clashes. They've said it. It's the first time, as Richard pointed out in his study, that a non-Caucasian power has dared to challenge the might of the United States. And when I was reading that, I thought, and Japan, how have we whitewashed Japan? Because Japan was the first non-Caucasian power to challenge Western industrial power. I don't believe in civilizational clashes because I'll tell you why, Christopher. Most of the wars, the culture wars, the civilizational wars I see are within countries, within civilizations. We have a culture war going on in the United States. In the UK, Brexit is a culture war. We see it in India, the young and the old. We see it in Turkey, secular and religious people. We see it in Russia. We see it in China. We see protests in Hong Kong. We have Kashmir, unrest in Kashmir. We have the yellow vests in France. We have protests in Russia. So the culture wars are really happening within civilizations, if you want to call them that, within countries and within cultures. The biggest gap I see in today's world is between those who are progressive and willing to change with the times, to adapt to changing times, and the traditionalists, the nostalgics, those, for instance, in Britain that are still harking back to the Raj, to the colonial times, I think, you know, and fantasizing about what never really existed. So that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges to our search for common ground, is that kind of a drift that's come in. Now, what heartens me are two things. One, we are creating, especially among young people, but even people my age, networks that are global, networks of solidarity that are global. Fridays for the Future, for instance, you know, you had people, the climate activists were out in Islamabad just as they were in New York, just as they were in London. So these networks, this is where power is at the moment, among young people who can connect. They can also be isolated and they can be radicalized, we know that, but they can also connect and create networks of friendship and solidarity that they do not have, perhaps, within their own communities. Perhaps the young person sitting in London feels more at home with the young Indian in Delhi talking about the same things than he does with his community. Very personally, I belong to a cult which is called the Freddie Mercury cult. Freddie Mercury, the frontman of Queen. I'm a big fan. And my networks of fans, similar fans, run across the world. Mexico, Peru, Bangladesh, Philippines. That's how we are connecting. And it's wonderful. We share the same sense of culture. We like that. And the third thing is soft power. Now, there's a wonderful book that Fatima Bhutto, the niece of Benazir Bhutto, has just written about the rise of other soft powers. So we've all been accustomed, especially people in my generation, to, as you said, Coca-Cola and Nike and, you know, all the American Elvis Presley and all the rest of it. Bollywood is an amazing soft power. She tells the story of going to Colombia, in a small village in Colombia, coming across a fan club for Shah Rukh Khan. Now, if you don't know Shah Rukh Khan, he is the big Bollywood star. He also happens to be a Muslim in India, which is great as well. And these people said something fascinating, Christopher. They said, you know, for the first time, we see a man who looks like us, is brown like us, and he's the hero. He's making changes. This narrative we have never seen in a Hollywood movie. And she talked about Turkish soap operas. All across the world, people are watching that. They're watching Brazilian soap operas. So the hegemony, the cultural hegemony of this construct of the West that we're talking about is really being diffused. I wouldn't say eliminated, because we all have also, as someone said, Gora rock, which means white rock. We all like that as well. But these cultures are becoming very important soft powers, and I think we need to remember that. The world's changing even as we speak. Now, two things that I wanted to come in on. One, what Amitabh said about how he felt sorry for the European Union. I don't think you should. I think the European Union has a good future, but what we are very frank about, and self-critical, as you said, is about how we go forward. What are the choices? What are the challenges we face? And that kind of open discussion that I find in Europe is something I was missing when I was a child in another country. And that is what Europe means to me. It means the freedom of being myself and of expressing myself. And Europe's soft power, or smart power, is something that we should not minimize also, because we live in a hard power world. But I think what connects us, again, is culture. And finally, to Natcha's point about Muslims being a part of Europe, absolutely. And I think this is one deficit, enormous deficit that we see across the European Union today. I think it's changing because Muslim communities themselves are producing superstars, political superstars, business superstars. So that narrative of victimhood and discrimination is changing. And finally, I'll say one thing to you as well. I mean, I belong to that sort of category of Europeans who really regret that we did not take a decision on Turkish membership when it was needed. And I think that was a big mistake, and we're paying now the price for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we've almost opened it up now for discussion between the panelists. However, we do have one discussant. That's the Argentinian ambassador to Russia. And if we can hear from you first of all, that would be great. Do you have a microphone?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I would invite you to sit here, but I don't think there's a seat. So if you can just... Oh, there is a seat. Please come and take a seat here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to try to be more practical. It's my profession. First of all, I think that if from a theoretical point of view, nobody will challenge the values. If we go through democracy, freedom of speech, so on and so forth, everybody will agree. But I think that the problem lies when we go to the implementation, to the practical dimension. I'm from Argentina. I'm from America. First of all, let me tell you that America is a continent. It's not just one country. America is a continent of 35 countries. And why I say this, because I think that we still have a mentality, an old mentality of Cold War when approaching matters. And I think that's maybe the first thing that has to be changed. Argentina is also part of Latin America. And as Alain Rouquier used to say, Amérique latine, c'est l'extrême Occident. We are the extreme Occident. But I don't want to discuss values because you know better. What I want to discuss is practical matters. So I'm a fan of pointillism, so if you allow me some brush strokes. First of all, you referred to soft power. 20 years before, Joseph Nye and Kyohen used to talk about interdependence. We live in an interdependent world. Let's not forget that. And in interdependent world, there's no room for binary world. This morning, there was some reference to one against the other. We are all alike, bigger, smaller, left, right, north, south. But when suffering the challenges of the day-to-day agenda, we are all equal. So I would like that we use more the concept of interdependence. We have to recover it. If we are interdependent, we need to build multilateralism. Multilateralism is not something given. It has to be built on a day-to-day basis. And it can be deconstructed on a day-to-day basis. For instance, the best roadmap that we have in multilateralism is the Global Agenda 2030, the 17 sustainable objectives. Nobody talks about it. And it was agreed by consensus. So either we are truly multilateral and we abide by that, or, as Prime Minister just said, we are just doing rhetorics. If we really want to be multilateral, let's not do rhetoric and let's play by our commitments. And the Agenda 2030 is a commitment of the whole of the international community. We need to commit ourselves to that. And if you allow me the last point, which as a diplomat, and I'm not just making propaganda to my profession, because diplomacy is talking and dialogue. This is an excellent forum of diplomats, because we are talking and dialoguing. My fear is that we are militarizing our political discourse. In the short term, the military solution is fast, is rapid, and I would say it's efficient. But in the medium and long term, it's not sustainable. So we should go back to more diplomatic solutions, putting aside the military response and looking for sustainability. So if I could leave you with a message, and again, I'm not doing propaganda, for diplomats, is that we should demilitarize the political agenda and give more room to diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. You want to come back?
I wanted to make two short comments about things that I heard through the day. One was early in the morning, I think someone suggested that the West is collapsing, and this is a matter of fact already. I suggest that we will not be rushing to judgments of this nature. This is somewhat simplistic. The West is not collapsing. The most important creations that dictate the nature of the lives of the entire world are created in the West on these days. The largest companies, the most important films, the most important books that are read around the world are created in the Western countries. It's true that sometimes the political leaders and the political rhetoric of some of the political leaders in the Western countries is not compatible to the values and to the rich tradition of the cultures of these countries. But to draw a conclusion from this to the bottom line that the West is collapsing, I think is somewhat simplistic and is not characteristic of the realities of life. The fashions that are imitated by the entire world are shaped in the West. Their dresses that shape the way that people dress in most of the world are created in the Western countries. And I can go on and on and on. Basketball, which was created in the Western world, is played now in Eastern countries or different cultures that never used to practice it before. Basketball and soccer and whatnot. If this is sport, just one example of what makes altogether the substance of life for the hundreds of billions of people. So I think that this is, if one wants to talk about politics, and to say that in terms of politics the Western world is collapsing, it brings me to the second point that I want to make. Look, the concept, someone said today that we live in a very dangerous world. Dangerous than what? More dangerous than the First World War, the beginning of the 20th century in Europe? More dangerous than the Second World War? More dangerous than the Cold War? That two superpowers for 40 years were standing one against the other with nuclear powers that could destroy the entire world and were threatening each other and talking about destructions, and the leader of one nation was banging on the table in the United Nations saying, "We will destroy you," and the other said similar things. Is it now more dangerous than that period? Let's not fall into these stupid and simplistic traps. We live in a much more mature world in spite of the simplistic rhetorics of some of its political leaders every now and then. We live in a world which has absorbed the pains of wars and understand the dangers and risks of potential military confrontations more than ever before. And that's why I said before that let's not lose track of the dramatic difference between the empty, bombastic rhetoric of some of the political leaders and the practical political moves that are much more restrained and careful, because people are aware of the possible political human price that we can pay. I entirely subscribe to the ambassador's suggestion that we will try to limit to the maximum possible the need of the militarization of our politics and our international connections, and resort into the basic values that connect human beings, which brings me to the something that we discussed last night in our opening session. This is precisely the value of such organizations as the DOC, which can separate themselves from the need of making a political impression and talk about values and needs and problems, including the problem of warming. Although I must say that as of recently, I talked with some very important scientists that told me something which I was not aware of, and perhaps it's not politically correct to even say it. But they said, look, the changes in the climate of the world, as they were researched over centuries, hundreds of thousands of years, show that the changing of the climate is cyclical. And the idea that all this is created by us for not being careful, for not doing the right things, is doubtful. I'm not an expert, so I can't pass an opinion about it, and I'm aware of the fact that the general consensus is that it is created by human beings, but strangely enough, there are many, many, many scientists which do not share this opinion. But to sum it up, what I want to say is that these issues can bring us together, and most likely they can be much more cultivated by organizations such as the DOC and others that can cross the barriers of geographic and political differences that sometimes separate us.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've opened this up, and it goes back to what we were saying this morning. We always come back to the question of the West versus the rest, which, by the way, was a term that was not invented by Samuel Huntington. It was invented by Kishore Mahbubani in 1991, and he said at that point, the Western unipolar moment, the West would be insufferable and would be intervening everywhere, as indeed it did in the 1990s and shortly afterwards. He's written a book recently called Has the West Lost It? So he clearly feels that, in fact, the tide is out. But without engaging in that, would any of the other panelists like to talk about that? Could I start with you in the sense that, are you going through a de-Westernizing process in Turkey?
Yes, you know that for the creation of Turkey, the fundament of Turkey, we are, as I said before, we are a modern secular country, and we are a country where the Turkish culture is very important, but we always, with the Atatürk, try to integrate the value of Western civilization. What is the value of Western civilization? It's all the knowledge, all the universal value in bracket, which is also very important for Turkey. But I think the danger is not trying to create a universal value. The real danger is trying to impose the culture, to impose an imperialist point of view to other cultures. The richness of Europe is the cultural diversity. This is the problem. When we look at the world today, we try to create a unique cultural global citizenship, which is also a program of European Union, which is, I think, an error. Because the richness of Europe is the cultural diversity. And the problem that we are living today, that we have a monologue of Western civilization. The Western civilization is not trying to understand the other civilization, which is the cultural relativism, which is very important. This is a knowledge that forgotten years ago. And in the case of Turkey, yes, they are living actually a real disappointment with Europe. This is why now Turkey is trying to find a way with their origin, which is the Central Asian, Eurasian part, which is also, I think, something which is very important for Turkey. Europe is a very meaningful peace process instrument, I think, European Union. But we observe that there's a real conflict between the member states because of Europe trying to create a unique cultural identity. This is the problem of Brexit. We are just observing with Brexit, and the Visegrad countries trying to also impose their willingness to Europe. And I think Turkey will always follow the Western knowledge, the Western civilization with the knowledge, technology, innovation, and so on. And Europe will always remain a very important partner for Turkey. But now Turkey is trying to find a new way, a new cultural way, which is its origin, which is the Central Asia and Eurasia. This is why there's a very intensive collaboration with Russia, with China, with India, with other countries, and Europe will always remain an important partner for us.
Well, on the question of West and de-Westernization, I don't think that's going to happen in the on the ground. But as a concept, so what we're seeing is that certain concepts live on because they are politically meaningful, analytically useful. But on the ground, the changes overtake them, and that's what will happen to West, or this idea of the rest. If you think West is problematic, talk of the rest. Well, what is the rest? I mean, do the BRICS actually represent the developing world? I doubt it very much. How can countries like China, India speak for? India speaks for Asia, China speaks. So I think we have to look at the rhetorical value of concepts and what the change is happening in the world. But that brings me to this idea of the global civilization. To me, global civilization is as problematic as whatever class of civilizations or civilization state. We are moving between two kind of extremes. And I like the idea of global civilization, but it's not going to happen. It's like saying world is flat, or we have a McDonald's world. Cultural diversity has always been there, will always be there, and it's a good thing. At the same time, we are not going to have also the other extreme where the world is breaking up into whether cultures or civilizations or regions. So it's possible to find some sort of a middle ground, and I go back to the meaning of universalism there. When you say something is universal, universal values, as I said in my study of civilizations, I cannot think of one civilization who doesn't think it has universal values, universal relevance. The Chinese think they are universal, the Indians think they're universal, the Incas and Mayas thought they are universal. But it's possible to maintain diversity and still have what I call pluralistic universalism. So this is where I come back to Robert Cox. You mentioned my colleague, I taught with him for 12 years. Cox made a distinction between two types of universalism. One is the Enlightenment, monistic universalism, that the perspective of a homogeneous reality. There is a good set of ideas, came out of the West, Enlightenment. Everybody should have it because it's good for us. He challenged that, and he said there is another kind of universalism, which now I have named pluralistic universalism, which means you accept diversity, take it for, as real, but still you will find there are a lot of commonalities. You can build common ground. And it is possible, I can give you many examples. I have written an article recently in SAIS, International Affairs of School of Advanced International Studies, where you compare the idea of just war, humanitarian law, from four civilizations: Islam, Hinduism, China, and Christianity. You can find that almost word by word, they have similar injunctions about not attacking civilians, not attacking dismounted soldiers. In fact, the Geneva Convention is almost word by word from, it's not from, but it reflects the wording of Code of Manu, 300 BC. And I actually put it there, you can read this article, and I quote from all this, that there are certain ideas which are universal, but they are from different civilizations, but they overlap, they converge. I will find the same thing about human rights. Human rights was not an invention of either the West or the non-West in the ancient world. Human rights is a modern construct, and neither Europe nor Asia had it before. And Europe might have developed it a little earlier than Asia, but Europe developed it at a time when the rest of the world were imprisoned by Europe under colonialism. They didn't have an independent voice. The moment the post-colonial states came up, they actually signed on to human rights. The Latin American countries had an Inter-American Declaration on Human Rights 7 months before the Universal Declaration. The African and Asian countries were leaders in the covenants on civil and political rights when Britain tried to protect its colonies with the support of the United States. So it's not true that the West supports universal political rights and the rest goes for cultural and economic rights. But the point I'm trying to make is that ideas about human rights, which is protecting people, were there in every culture, not the institutions. There are human rights you can claim against the state. That is more modern in both the West and the rest. But the idea of protecting people is every civilization. In Jewish culture, in Hindu culture, I can provide many examples. So why don't we have a dialogue that actually builds on that commonality and based on actual research, as opposed to just simply making statements. And you'll find that you can get into some universal position. Not a global position, but a universal position that acknowledges diversity but finds enough common ground to develop a code of ethics.
Sorry, may I just,
Yes.
just I totally agree with Mr. Acharya that since the 1990s, since the Iraqi war, in the name of democracy and human rights, there are more than 4 million people who died in the name of democracy and human rights. And this is why it's not acceptable to try to impose a universal democracy or universal way of thinking or way of human rights. And we can see the consequences now in the world, which is a tragedy. So, thank you.
Let me just invite any of the other panelists to speak to this particular issue.
May I pick up there we started to talk about universalism. If in your statement I got it correct, you say universalism, this is equal to diversity. If it is so, then I am voting for. But you know, in the concept of recent political movements, universalism is equal to standardization. Be standard, and that we cannot accept. So from this point of view, I suppose we need a little bit squeeze back to the title of this roundtable discussion. We are talking about civilization state, we are talking about globalization, and we are talking about multilateralism. I should admit that we were hardly thinking how to replace, you know, bilateral world or a multipolar world. And we found the formula, multilateralism, which is referring to diversity of the civilizations which we agree upon. And I suppose we should stick to that. If we are talking about the world, you know, I shall tell you, I'm clinical optimist. But you know, I'm not that optimistic like you, so possibly I'm well-informed, you know, optimist, a little bit pessimistic. World is dangerous just because, you know, there is a tendency to simplify the processes. Just, you know, to say, listen, it can be a list, exclusive list of something which everyone should adopt, and then we will live in the world of peace. You know, if we are all the same, then where the controversies are coming from, where the conflicts are coming from. If it is only, you know, the conflict inside civilizations, then how to explain the denied, you know, conquer of Arab world? It is not, was not the same civilization, may I say so? So, to me, it is very essential what we are talking about. We're accepting the understanding of civilizations as diversity of people with historical heritage, culture, tradition, etc. But we are stating those differences. They are to collaborate and to have a dialogue, not to have clash of civilization. I agree with you here. When I read the book of Huntington, he was, you know, in favor of civilizations at the time when nobody wanted to talk about civilizations as a diversity. But he pretended that inevitable clash of civilization is going. And sometimes what we observe as terrorist attacks, somebody would like to say that is the reflection of clash of civilization. It is not. Terrorism has no religion, and terrorism is not being to be considered as civilization element.
The German philosopher Heidegger said that when the whole world became European, then Europe would disappear from its own imagination because it would have no one to speak to or talk to. So that's the problem. That's the important thing about dialogue, is you maintain the diversity. Last word, because we then have to wrap up.
So, Christopher, that's not going to happen. The whole world is not going to turn European. There is wisdom outside Europe, as we're recognizing. And what I find very interesting in today's world is, you know, for a very long time, for centuries, the West went east. We had imperialism, Raj, colonialism across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America to some extent. And now we are seeing the East coming west. I think that's so powerful, and this is so exciting. We have scholars like Amitabh, we have people across the West who are coming from different cultures, if you want to put it that way, and that are enriching our Western culture. I think this is something we should not forget. It has turned into a circular kind of brain circulation. People are coming and moving around, and that is so valuable. I would encourage you, and I tell my students at the College of Europe, if you want to understand countries, don't just talk to diplomats and politicians or academics like us, read the literature, and especially read contemporary literature, whether it's written by Indians or Brazilians or Mexicans. Read all the people who win prizes, whether it's the Booker Prize or whatever. These stories, whether it's Alif Shafak from Turkey, these are the stories, whether it's Arundhati Roy from India, Fatima Bhutto in Pakistan, and others. These are the stories that tell you what societies are really living through. What are the things that are bringing people together in these societies? What patriarchy is doing to the women? How children are being treated? The class struggles? These are beautiful books to be read, and that is what I think inspires us. And if I could just say, finally, today, the Nobel Peace Prize was announced. And it's the Ethiopian Prime Minister who's got the Peace Prize. And I think that is also acknowledgement in the Nobel Prize Committee of the world that is changing. That people outside this construct of the West, there's wisdom outside, there's information outside, there is peace, people who love peace outside, that we cannot look for the mirror image. We have to respect differences and find common ground.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we do have to end, so we've eaten into your coffee break.
Professor, I have a very special request. I want in 2 minutes to share with you a personal experience that I had as mayor of Jerusalem. And you will understand immediately why it is relevant to everything that was said here. Please, if it's all right.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. I was elected 26 years ago to be mayor of the most divided and pluralistic city in the world. In Jerusalem, there are 42 different Christian denominations, 42 different Christian denominations, more than any city in the world, more churches of different affiliations than any city in the world. You think Rome is religious? Nothing like Jerusalem. You have many different groups, Islamic groups, which are different from each other, which are sensitive to each other, which don't like each other, which have a history of confrontation and conflicts and so on. And you have Jews, ultra-Orthodox, moderate Orthodox, different Hasidic groups, each is different from the others. When I took over, there was a big concern, how will this young man at that time, yes, once I was younger, will be able to handle all this diversity and the complexity and the contradictions it may erupt into who knows what. And the advice that experienced people came and told me was, try to find a common ground that will unite all these different groups so that you will be able to keep, some kind of cooperation. It was the worst advice I ever got in my life. Worst advice. Why? Because it turned out that the most important thing for all these different groups was to maintain the difference from the others and to maintain their tradition and their legacies and their memories, and not to try and somehow remove those unique characteristics for an artificial common background that will unite them all. And the wisdom of running a city like this without eruptions of hostilities and wars and whatnot is to try and protect the diversity within the framework of common life together. And I think that this is exactly the difference between universality, which is not standardization, universality which keeps diversity.
That's what I meant, not homogenizing.
Okay.
Diversity.
2 minutes.
Right? That was the 2 minutes.
Still find common ground.
Right, okay. Sorry, we really do, because I'm trespassing on the good nature of our audience, who have been very quiet and very polite. If you want to talk about universality, you should have a look at the Star Trek franchise, which is all about the Federation, which the Klingons call a humans-only club. But sometimes you do get an ironical moment. If you have a look at Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, you will find the Klingons putting on a performance of a Shakespeare play in the original Klingon. So you can get cultural appropriation even in deep space on these occasions, and that's called universalism. So thank you very much to all our panelists for their very valuable contributions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will be back in here at 4:4 with an onstage interview. If you could join us then, we'd be really grateful. As always, if you have any translation equipment, please return it. And if you have taken one to your room accidentally earlier, please return it. Thank you.